I mean, one of the big global issues that everyone is ignoring is the scale of urban problems in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This can be seen in the fact that most aid agencies give no priority to urban. Many have no urban policy. Yet the scale of the urban population has increased 600% in the last 50 years. Africa, Asia, and Latin America now have most of the world's urban population. They have most of the world's cities. They have most of the world's largest cities. Most of the growth in the world's population in the next 2 decades will be in urban areas in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But a huge part of this population lacks basic needs. For instance, about 1 billion live in slums and squatter settlements. Informal settlements, housing they largely built themselves, usually only using poor quality materials because all they can afford. Most lack piped water. Most lack any form of sanitation. Most urban centres in Africa, Asia have no sewers at all. Those that have sewers, it often serves only 5 to 10% of the population. And one can guess which end of the population they actually serve. Of course, it's the middle and upper income groups. Most of the population living in slums and squatter settlements has no access to healthcare, no access to schools, or they have to use private facilities they fund themselves because they're outside any government provision. Most governments refuse to actually provide services in squatter settlements because the land is occupied or subdivided illegally. Many squatter settlements develop on very dangerous sites, on floodplains, on land at risk from landslides, because this is the only land that the elites and the governments will allow them to settle on. Most lack a legal address. In many nations, if you don't have a legal address, you can't vote. You don't get on the voters' register. You can't get your kids into public schools or into government-funded healthcare systems. And of course, a very large proportion of the low-income urban population is very vulnerable to climate change. Climate change is going to bring increased frequency and intensity of storms. Sea level rise will mean that those on the coast are heavily at risk. And of course, because it's the poorer groups that live in the floodplains, they're the first people to get flooded. The astonishing thing is most international agencies ignore this. The scale of urban poverty is enormously underestimated by the use of, frankly, stupid and simplistic criteria for measuring poverty. People love to talk about the $1-a-day poverty line, but a poverty line has to be adjusted to take account of the costs, the local costs. In most cities, poorer groups are paying a high cost for water from a water vendor because they don't have pipe supplies, for defecation because they have to use a public toilet, for schools because they're using private schools because there's no public school available, for healthcare, for transport. Very often the poorest settlements are on the periphery of a city. Again, it's the only place they can get land where they can live, which means very high transport costs. The other sad issue is that all these international agencies legitimate themselves on the basis that they're meeting poor people's needs. Yet they're not accountable to poor groups, they don't listen to poor groups, most of their staff can't even talk to poor groups because they don't talk their language. They aren't transparent in that they don't actually publish who gets the money. The astonishing thing is you can do a test. You could take 300 women who belonged to a savings group who lived in a squatter settlement or who were homeless. Those 300 women form a savings group, which is very common. They each contribute a small amount of money every day to that savings group, and each member can draw on that money in an emergency. Now, say these 300 women were offered some cheap land, which they could buy legally. Almost no international agency would lend them money. They can't cope with the smallness of the demands that these women would make. They can't cope with these women actually repaying the loan. So to me, the key issue is how on earth do we get the international agencies actually to interact with, work with, support, listen to the urban poor? At the moment, very few have the structure that allows them to do so. Now, there's some signs of hope. There's some very remarkable local governments, especially in Latin America, very often with mayors elected from outside the conventional political parties that have brought a commitment to working with poorer groups, to listening. The innovation pioneered in Brazil in participatory budgeting is particularly important. I've seen it in operation in Porto Alegre, a very successful Brazilian city. Participatory budgeting gives each community, each residential community, the possibility of influencing public works investments in their particular area. It also means much greater accountability. Everyone knows how the municipal budget is used and how it's spent. I suppose the biggest sign of hope, however, isn't within local governments, but it's within the organizations that poorer groups are forming themselves. Perhaps the most exciting is that in 15 nations, slum-dwelling organizations, squatter organizations, have formed their own federations. So you'll get the National Federation of Slum Dwellers in India. You'll get the South African Federation of the Urban Poor. You've got similar national federations in countries such as Namibia, Malawi, Kenya, growing in Ghana, developing in Tanzania, very strong in Thailand, very strong in the Philippines, strong in Cambodia. So developing very strongly in Africa and Asia, also a new and very successful one in Brazil. These are important for two reasons. One, it's what they can do themselves. Most of these have their own projects. They get land, they build, or they improve their own homes. They install infrastructure. They set up their own services. In India, they've set up community police stations in many squatter settlements with the support of the police. However, they're more important than this because it's what they can do in partnership with local governments, where local governments will actually work with them, partner them. The scale of what they can achieve is enormous. Unfortunately, at the moment, none of the official bilateral agencies find it easy to support them. The Swedish bilateral aid program and the British bilateral aid program are experimenting with funding channel to these remarkable federations, but it's very difficult institutionally to do so. So I suppose to me the challenge for governments, the challenge for aid agencies is how to support local development. How to support local development that's accountable to poorer groups. How to support the initiatives of the poorer groups themselves so they can bring their knowledge, their capacity to organize, their ability to do things much cheaper than anyone else. Once those work in partnership with local government, then we really could turn the tide and reduce urban poverty.